My work began before I was born. It started with my grandmother. Joanne Lee Tinnell was born on Rosebud Reservation in the 1930s. Her name was Fidel Pearl Quickbear. She was born to Philip Quickbear and an unknown woman. When she was a toddler, much like me, she was adopted by a family off of the reservation, at which point her name was changed and she was stripped of her culture. She died in Rapid City General Hospital of sepsis, a treatable blood disease, when I was 5. I didn't know then what I know now. My grandmother was a part of the forced Indian adoptions which plagued the 30s. She was sold to a white family for money, assimilated into their culture, and ultimately died due to a lack of health care because of the color of her skin. My work begins to examine that deeply held intergenerational trauma. The triptych of collage photographs begins to tell a story, both in title and narrative. A breast form mannequin surrounded by tools and medical supplies as the form was prepared for surgery. The second is a micro close-up of the form mid-surgery, and the third being the graphic aftermath of surgery before the dressing is applied. I inverted the colors of these prints, turning them on their head and placing the work in an uncanny valley of reality and surreality, a space that I know well and that I have floated in between, reclaiming my nativeness and choosing to hide it. The bust form itself sits as is, bandaged from the damage of surgery on an apartment floor. Standing directly over the form, whiteness shows along the small of its back. This is an examination of the struggle between accepting my queer identity within a native lens and also holding on to the trauma that generations of assimilation causes. Transness, or the concept of it, existed within Lakota culture without prejudice and at times was considered a spiritual part of the identity. Therefore, I should not be ashamed of my own relationship to gender, but due to my upbringing and the way that religion intertwined with my familial identity, I fought shame for so long, and I began to examine that in this work. This first portion of my thesis addresses the logical part of my struggle with nativeness. In the United States, Indigenous people live 5.5 years less than the average citizen, are more likely to die from treatable diseases, and are more susceptible to preventable illnesses, according to the Indian Health Service. This is from a systemic lack of health care, something that I now face, something that my grandmother faced. I inserted myself into this work, and as I began to understand more about myself, I began to understand more about the work and what I wanted it to be. The second portion of my work begins to talk about feelings, a direct response to a call that I suddenly felt. To have been defined as white by an outside source, by the world essentially, and to know that I wasn't brought back memories. Casual racism towards Indigenous people is so common to me that sometimes I forget it's there, that it affects me, and that it hurts. But I decided to face it. It started with cataloging every racist thing that I could remember being said to me. Then I transferred each phrase onto a full-scale white mannequin, and I took it to a field. I ran barefoot at it with a coop stick. A coop stick is a tool used by indigenous warriors meant to be used for the first kill of battle. Each kill received a notch or a decoration, which marked the amount of honor a warrior had. I considered the mannequin to be one kill, because each phrase added together made up my view of my race and of myself, and I killed that. I eventually moved on to more modern tools, a hammer. I chose a hammer explicitly, as my family that still resides in South Dakota are roofers by trade, largely because those are the only jobs available to them. This is partly due to a lack of education they received. Many still do not have their high school diploma, and that becomes a bigger theme when diving into the titling of this work. The titles of these works become a sort of puzzle, or maybe more of a linear scavenger hunt. Together, the titles spell out, "What if I told you, every minute of every second of every day, I am afraid, if I fail, I will let my family down." This touches on my identity in relation to academia. I'm a part of the first generation in my family to get a high school diploma. Of that generation, I am one of 3 that finished a bachelor's degree. Of those 3, I am the only one to pursue graduate work. I understand the amount of work that my degree took, and I understand the immense amount of privilege that I've had to finish it. Every day, I am afraid that this wasn't real or that I will somehow categorically mess up so badly that everything will be taken from me and it will erase all of the work that I've done. because I see it in the faces of my distant family and I hear it in their voices. To know that one of us could become something is something for all of us. It is a sign that it is possible for any of us, for Indigenous people to have a narrative that is controlled by them. I was influenced by so many artists, movements, and moments, and they make my work what it is. As Martha Rosler said in her famous essay, A View on Modernism, "Look," he said slowly, "there are days when Stella goes to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he sits for hours looking at the Velasquez, utterly knocked out by them, and then he goes back to his studio. What he would like more than anything is to paint like Velasquez, but he knows that that is not an option that is open to him. So he paints stripes." Fried's voice had risen. He wants to be Velasquez, so he paints stripes. I want to be so many people that I've admired for 5 years, but I can't be them, so I learn from them. Thomas Cole famously painted the oxbow. It was a part of the landscape movement. What I dove into this movement for wasn't what was there, but what wasn't there. This era existed within manifest destiny, when indigenous treaties were kept and reservations were becoming an idea. So these large roaming areas would have had indigenous people, but they aren't there. They were erased from the narrative. That erasure, the removal, became the most interesting thing to me. The fact that Native people were removed from the narrative and that I am now reinserting it back into the narrative of fine art. Martha Rosler's retrospective also became pivotal to me. Every material that I used was upcycled because I wanted this work to be as wholly beneficial for the planet as possible. This is a core Lakota value, but also overall a Native value. Similarly, she made work into a community event as it was an active yard sale. I try to make my work into a dialogue, a conversation, a desire to dig in deeper to the theory and research behind the idea. I try to make it an exchange of knowledge, of thought, with the hopes that it could potentially influence a Native lens further into contemporary art. I've looked to modern Native artists as well, hoping to gain wisdom from them, to understand their work, and to understand what I might be missing from my work. Janu Quick to See Smith became one of the feminine cornerstones of my research. She said in one interview, "It's like we don't exist, except in movies and sports teams, like the Washington Redskins or the Cleveland Indians." She helped me realize how invisible I felt, and also that what she called the buckskin ceiling is real, and it's intense, and it presses on me. But it's there, and no one person can break it, but a tribal effort could. Her work gave me hope, and it keeps me going. It reminds me why I do what I do, and I see a lot of myself in her. Kanupa Huska Luger also was a big source of inspiration for me in this work. His Mirror's Shield project told a story about survival, an emotion that I live in almost constantly. The way that a mirror is used to shield protests, reflecting back the US government's actions, a peaceful plea to not hurt us further, a prayer that our families would continue to have water. But as history goes, that wasn't meant to be. And so much of my work is trying to recontextualize history and the Native narrative and to understand why and how these things happened. And I feel like my work is in dialogue with his, that they run alongside each other. This thesis has been a jumping off point for me. I finished this work and I see where it's going. Now I'm pursuing graduate work at the University of Washington. I'm in a show with the Kentucky Arts Council right now, and I'm proud of what I've done, and I'm even more excited to see what I'm going to do.